Great. So yes, thank you for that kind of introduction. And it's great to be with you. It would be nice to be with you in person. I'm sorry I'm not there in person now, but looking forward to hopefully seeing you all at ICRA in a couple of weeks. So as Mark had mentioned, we do things in a variety of contexts. They tend to be connected by way of mechanics, materials, manufacturing, design of hopefully novel, interesting platforms for robotics. In the past, that has tended to be things at small scales, and it continues for some of our work. I'm not going to talk too much about that unless I have some time at the end, but today I want to focus on some of the stuff that we've been doing with soft manipulation. And I'll motivate this for us in a minute. But again, the common threads across all of our work tends to be some of the sort of physical hardware components of the robot platforms themselves, trying to see if we can develop platforms that by virtue of how they're made, what materials they're made of, can do tasks that would perhaps make some canonical challenges in locomotion and manipulation canonical throughout the robotics research, make those a little bit easier perhaps. And so that's one of the things we're going to be talking about today, but that's a common theme. What we want to aim for is delicate and dexterous robotic manipulation. So I would argue that mostly, okay, and historically, that robotic manipulation has been focused on the latter part of this, the dexterous part of this. And so there's been a ton of effort, and I won't do this justice. I'll give a little bit of an overview, but like my claim is that again, the majority of past work has been on the dexterous part. Soft robotics comes into play now in the last, in particular, I mean, it's a 40-year-old field, but in particular into focus in the last 10 or 12 years or so. And that's been focused more on the delicate side. So this talk is going to be looking at how to merge both of those concepts. And this is a lot of these challenges for us, in particular for trying to think of how we as humans manipulate objects in our everyday lives in ways that we take for granted. You can take a more sort of classic principled approach to what Julia Child here is doing in terms of thinking about all of the different contacts that are being made, the constraints that are being applied, how the human is manipulating the tool, how the tool affects these contact constraints. And then I would model all of these, and the classical approach might be to then rely on active control, a lot of perception, both sort of more proprioceptive in terms of the pressures and that her hands are feeling, making sense of what objects she's holding and interacting with, as well as the more exteroceptive, trying to understand the scene and where things are positioned relative to each other, et cetera. Okay, so that's the more classic approach, I would argue. Oh, this is another example of impressive human dexterity. This is my son doing stick tricks. And I would say again that the sort of more classical approach has been on the dexterity side. And so this is just a very brief overview of what I think are sort of representative hands. And this is not exhaustive, of course, of the last 50 years of research on robotic hands. Many of these tend to be anthropomorphic in nature, and that makes sense. I mean, we exist in a human constructed world for human hands, so it makes sense to think about having robot hands that would have sort of similar characteristics in terms of the numbers of degrees of freedom and the type and the sizes and the types of objects that can be grasped. And then the dexterity. So then these tend to be very high numbers of degrees of freedom, anthropomorphic in nature. The high number of degrees of freedom brings challenges, understandably, for how we might actuate these things. How do we get all 20-something motors, or in most of these cases, cable-driven assemblies, to actuate all of these segments? So there's been a lot of success here, and I think that these hands have been, in particular, over the last couple of decades, where people are starting to realize that we can achieve the number of degrees of freedom, similar number of degrees of freedom as human hands, similar morphologies, et cetera. And able to do things like I was showing with Julia Child and my son in terms of complex in-hand manipulation. I'm going to use, by the way, throughout, I'm going to use in-hand manipulation as sort of a target for very complex things that we can do within a hand. And this sort of differentiates, I think, in my mind, from using the manipulator itself for reorienting an object. If I want to reorient an object in the absence of motion of the manipulator, in-hand manipulation is my only choice. And so that's I guess a proxy for dexterity that I'm going to be using throughout this talk. So there's been a lot of recent work, in particular now, taking the sort of complexity that I was alluding to a couple slides ago and how to make sense of all of these context constraints and motions and degrees of freedom and perception challenges, and now moving to a more model-free approach with using some machine learning techniques. And this has been very successful with, for example, the OpenAI project, being able to show that through a lot of training, now, many hundreds of years worth of training, that you can do a lot of these manipulation tasks. Okay, so that's great. So I propose, though, to make this problem a little bit easier by strategically using compliance to overcome the errors that I might have in understanding all of these constraints, these contacts, these irregular shaped objects, etc. And then again instead rely on some compliance within the manipulator itself. So to do that, I think that I can break this down into several key questions. One is how to make soft yet strong manipulators. So this is something I don't want to lose. So with a lot of these robot hands, they have fairly sizable payload capacities. I think with soft manipulators, I think we can actually do far better, and I'll explain that in a minute. How to reconcile the dimensionality for design, modeling, and control. So that basically just means, like, how do I think about designing these hands, given the fact that I went from something that is sort of rigid serial chain manipulator kind of kinematic kind of hand designs. Now I'm making them more continuously compliant. How do I reconcile? Now I went from some small number, tens of degrees of freedom, to effectively infinite. And then what can we learn from sort of bioinspiration here? How can we take inspiration from human, both sort of manipulator design, hand designs, as well as some perception and neuromechanics? So I want to just give a brief history, and again, I'm not going to be able to do justice to the field here, but soft robotics is not new. This is something that has been, in the 80s. If you look back through, you can find these on YouTube, I think, some videos from Professor Suzumori back in the 80s. He's doing amazing things with soft manipulators that look surprisingly similar to some of the things that we've been doing more recently in the 2010s. And some of the first fluidic soft actuators and manipulators and devices, as well as some really interesting strategies for making these things. I first came aware of soft robotics when I was a graduate student in the late 90s, when Ian Walker and others were making some of the first bio-inspired continuum manipulators that were inspired by elephant trunks. I found that to be fantastically innovative in terms of taking inspiration from biology in a sort of non-traditional way. And then around the 2010, there was a program in DARPA called the ChemBots, Chemical Robots, and that launched, as the name implied, it was trying to move robots away from more traditional form factors and into more materials approach. And so that launched a number of interesting projects, including this universal jamming gripper that you see in the middle on the right, some of the work in George Whiteside's group, which subsequently led to one of the first companies focused on soft robotics, named Soft Robotics. Also, sort of science fiction started to catch up as well, and you all know Baymax from Big Hero 6 is being inspired by and inspiring for soft robotics. The Soft Robotics Toolkit, so people started to realize that these were techniques that were rather accessible, and so people could sort of pick these things up and use them without too much infrastructure or costs. So the Soft Robotics Toolkit launched to enable that. The first journal dedicated to soft robotics, also called Soft Robotics, was launched. This for a while to show the impact of this area. This for a few years, at least until the journal Science Robotics came out, was by far the highest impact journal in all of robotics, if you buy that sort of thing. And then there's a number of other firsts that I'll get to throughout this talk. So now the concept of adding compliance into robot hands is not new. We are certainly not the first to be thinking about this. So I'm just going to give a couple of what I think are some of the highlights here. First is by my colleague who sits 20 feet away from me here, by Rob Howe and one of his former students, Aaron Dollar, who's at Yale. They created these compliant robot fingers that were made out of the process called shape deposition manufacturing. I won't go into the details of that, but it was basically a way to create mechanisms, articulated mechanisms with all sorts of different combinations of materials. And they were able to show through not just the sort of materials here, but also through a very clever way to drive the fingers in a sort of non-deterministic way. They're able to create fingers which can passively adapt to a variety of different objects, showing a huge adaptability over a range of object sizes and shapes. And that was very successful. That actually launched a very successful startup locally here called RightHand Robotics, based upon these kind of gripper designs. Mark Kokoski and his group has applied similar techniques. This is one of our favorite examples of this in Ocean One, which is a teleoperated marine robotics telepresence platform, whereby you can use these similar kind of things that look kind of similar to those shape deposition manufacturing fingers to do delicate and complex grasps. Moving on, we worked with Jennifer Lewis's group here, just thinking now more about how these types of complex fingers could be designed. One of the natural questions one might have is how could I put sensors in these devices? And a couple of years ago, Jennifer Lewis and her group were developing a technique which you just saw called embedded 3D printing, where you could print stable inks within uncured elastomeric materials, cure those elastomeric materials, and evacuate the inks that were sort of holding in their place. Those form channels. You could backfill those channels now with whatever materials you want. Conductive inks, for example, that might do resistive-based pressure sensors, for example, that's being showed here. Somewhat related, Rob Shepard's group has created this really fascinating soft robot hand, again, thinking about sensing now, where sensing is being used. There's optical sensors here, which they were able to show was so sensitive to different shape changes that they could determine, for example, the difference between a ripe and an unripe tomato. Similarly, Oliver Brock's group, now not optically but acoustically, had a brilliant way to sensorize their soft fingers and use some machine learning techniques to try to determine the position and magnitude of different applied stresses within their hand. And lastly, one of the last things I want to show you is, again, moving forward, moving closer and closer to this sort of theme of in-hand manipulation. Again, Oliver Brock's group has been one of the most successful in designing soft anthropomorphic hands that can have not just the ability to do power grasps, not just the ability to pinch grasp, but also to be able to reorient objects within a stable grasp. All right. So again, not exhaustive, but that's kind of a brief snapshot of the field and what we think are some really good examples of moving towards this concept of soft manipulation using soft materials, and not just for delicate, not just to be delicate, but also to be dexterous. I want to just give you a little bit of a story of sort of where we entered this field. So we started off not necessarily thinking about soft manipulation, but we started off here. So I was at a meeting with the National Geographic Society, and I was seeing this video for the first time from a colleague of mine, and he was showing this video of trying to grasp these organisms. This is a surprisingly agile echinoderm at the bottom of the ocean, using these very rigid sort of jaws of life looking rippers. And unsurprisingly, is very successful either capturing it, or if you did capture it, you're going to mangle the thing. And what his goal was, he's a marine biologist, this is David Gruber, his goal was to capture organisms intact, bring them to the surface unharmed, and then study them for the sake of discovering new species, and also studying how marine organisms were adapting to the effects of climate change. So the mangling part was really bad, and that's even more exacerbated when you see this organism like this glass sponge, things that are very brittle. That there's really no hope of collecting anything like this intact. And there's a more subtle thing here that I'll get to in a minute, but some of these organisms at the bottom of the ocean are up to tens of thousands of years old, and so we want to be as respectful and gentle as we can, and if we're going to take a sample, maybe just take as small of a sample as possible and leave the organism intact. So this gave a really great, I saw this video and it was like, well, we could do far better than that, right? Especially even though this was in the early 2010s, we were already making things like this. This was some of our first examples of making elastomeric fluidic, these are just pneumatic actuators that are effectively elastomeric balloons that have some reinforcements, inaccessible reinforcements positioned within them such that you could get very simple things like extension bending, extension twisting, bending, twisting, coupling, et cetera, where you can create these complex motions just by choice of how you're reorienting the reinforcements within these elastomeric bladders to create whatever motion primitives you want. And then you could compose these individual simple actuators as digits in a hand and do simple, in this case, just a power grasp. Okay, so that was straightforward, and then we pitched a project together that said, okay, well let's combine these two efforts, take some of these soft hands, design them for the species that you want to interact with. We pitched this to the National Geographic Society. We went on an expedition down to the Red Sea, and this was a shameless plug to our sponsors here. This is us deploying for the first time this soft finger here. And the way that this works is very simple. So if I can imagine wanting to go to the bottom of the ocean and sampling this whip coral species, you can imagine that this is on a remotely operated vehicle, the one I just showed you in the previous slide. This is not very stable itself. I'm on a boat. This is only a couple hundred meters deep, but you can imagine in subsequent videos they'll show, being several kilometers above on a boat that's rocking. I only have 2D vision. And I have a rigid claw-like hand that I need to do a pinch grasp on something that is itself perhaps moving with local currents, et cetera. This is an impossible task, right? Instead, we developed this finger. This just has a bending, twisting coupling that forms a helix when I actuate this. And I get close enough, I turn it on, and it just wraps around, and I can sample this and take it away. So it's a sort of a trivial control problem now. I just have to get close enough. But we can do more sort of anthropomorphic-like things. This is the first grasp of this sort of broccoli-looking like coral. We then subsequently took this all over the world's oceans. That was the first success, but started to catch on. So this is on the Nautilus now off the coast of California. This is about, I think, 1,800 meters deep, grabbing these rather alien-looking holothuria. But these things basically have the consistency of wet tissue paper. So being able to grasp something this gentle there's no really other way to do it, at least using the technologies that are available on most current ROVs. So anyways, we're able to pick this thing up and put it back down. So we, with that in mind, and I'll just fast forward. Okay, great. We'll pick it up. With that in mind, we could do more hard-bodied organisms as well. Let's pick up this crab here and give it a hug. We're able to extend that. I won't get too much into this. We're able to extend that to manned submersibles too. There's a person in here, Brendan Phillips, who's now at the University of Rhode Island, is wearing a haptic glove, which is then controlling this soft arm and hand. So now we're extending it beyond just the soft hand to a soft arm, and also have the ability to sort of a step towards more natural control of this thing through a wearable device, which makes sense if I'm sitting there inside this robot. I kind of want to be able to feel and manipulate what's on the outside. And this is one way to potentially do this. I'll just go briefly through this. This is not necessarily soft or dexterous. This is just taking the concept of being gentle one step further by not even touching an organism, by just creating a device that kind of gets close enough, wraps around an organism, sort of captures it momentarily, studies it, morphometrics or chemistry for respiration or whatever, take a little biopsy to do some genetic sequencing, whatever, and then lets it go. And so you're not harming the animal, you're pissing it off, but you're not harming it, and you're letting it go free afterwards. Okay. So coming back to, that was a very long, 20-minute way of introducing you to the way that I think about this field of soft manipulation, trying to then answer some of these questions I was posing, and that's what I'm going to get to now, and then our sort of entry into it by way of thinking about the delicate side. So coming into it from like, okay, really challenging environments, bottom of the ocean, really difficult things to grasp, these moving, living creatures that are very, very delicate themselves. So if we can do that, then what else can we do? So can we go from, I just showed you very briefly that we can do the delicate part, no problem. Those are fairly straightforward things. Can we do some of these other things, like, can we make them soft yet strong? Can we make them soft yet dexterous? So that's what I'll spend some time on now talking about. And so this first one is talking about soft yet strong. So this was work with Daniela Roos at MIT through our postdoc Shuguang Li, and he had this really fascinating concept. So he recognized that we want to create these soft manipulators. Now, we're not necessarily talking about the end effector per se. This is a more generic concept for soft actuation, which is very high energy density and very lightweight. And so what we want to do is be able to have delicate manipulation, as I've already been talking about in dexterous manipulation, but also powerful. So this is something that sometimes gets lost. So I'll just say a little bit about how this works. So this is based upon an actuation concept called foam. This is the acronym is fluidic origami inspired artificial muscles. And the way that this works is you have this sort of in blue here, this sort of internal structure, which is just, in this case, a very simple zigzag folded pattern that you wrap an elastomeric bladder around. And then if I do this, I suck a vacuum on this, then the pressure differential and the tension that forms in the elastomeric skin forms a contraction. That contraction is then guided by the fold pattern that you have created within your origami sort of skeleton, if you will. And that creates an overall contraction. So that creates an extremely simple, programmable, meaning that I can create whatever sort of shape and whatever motions that I want by virtue of my internal fold pattern, and very powerful, very lightweight structures. So I can do these kinds of really heavy, lift these really heavy objects with a very lightweight manipulator. And so you can do this not just for sort of linear contracting actuators. I can do this again with any sort of arbitrary origami shape device within my skeleton to match whatever objects I might want to grasp. So for in terms of power grasp, we're able to do things like this, lifting this tire, which might be, I don't know, 10 or 20 kilograms. And I can do this with just by simply pulling a vacuum on all these actuators. There's actually these foam-based actuators in the sort of arm itself, as well in this sort of big hand here. And so what's the big deal? We can lift up a tire. The one thing that we wanted to point out here was that if we think about the sort of payload to arm weight, this is where this becomes a big win. So if I think about that ratio as my metric, then I get, for a 2 kilogram arm and a 20 kilogram payload, that ratio is going to be about 10. And if I look at something like a standard sort of industrial manipulation arm, much heavier, much lower payload, and I'm going to get, that number is going to be much less than 1. And this is not an apples to apples really fair comparison, but it kind of gives a glimpse into how we think about this as wouldn't it be nice to have soft arms that could be dexterous, that could be delicate, and that could have payloads that are comparable to their own self-weight. This also turns out to be a pretty robust grasper in and of itself. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but again, by virtue of how I create this internal fold structure, I can be robust to a whole bunch of different object sizes and shapes, as well as positioning errors. And this sort of gives a glimpse of how this is operating. Very simple concept. Okay, so what we want to get to now is moving on to this question of how to get dexterity back to my soft manipulators. So I would argue that when I went from my many tens of degrees of freedom anthropomorphic hands, rigid hands that have been under development for the past 50, 60 years, now to these sort of soft actuator based hands, I lost a lot of dexterity here. I'm back drivable, which is nice because I can be sort of conformal to whatever objects I have in my grasp. That's great, but now I have some for example, positioning errors. Perhaps I have much less actuated degrees of freedom. I have a lot of passive degrees of freedom, but I have less actuated degrees of freedom than a lot of those other examples. But how can I get back? And where might I be able to get to using these soft digits? And so that's a study that we have been doing, and I'm just going to give you snapshots into some of the details of these studies in terms of how we think about the individual digit designs in our hands, how we think about the overall hand designs and arrangements of these digits, how we think about some of the ancillary structures in terms of like the palm itself, as well as some of the surface properties. And I'll tell you a little bit about how we make some of these things as well. So the first thing that we did, which is a fairly obvious thing, which is thinking about, okay, well, we can make these actuated fingers. And I was really just showing you sort of single DOF motions in all of the hand designs that I've shown you thus far. Let's add additional degrees of freedom to each of the digits. Okay, that's fine. So the first thing that we did was try to add an additional degree of freedom in parallel, such that I can have basically my sort of original concept of a bending actuator. Now I basically split it into two, so that I can still create my same bending motion, but I can also create like a lateral motion if I differentially actuate either one of these channels. So that gives me a very quick, and this is illustrated on the right here, a very quick way to do some basic motion primitives. For example, I can just do simple translations. This I could do before if I just have two opposing fingers, just by actuating them sort of, sequentially. I can have basic motion primitives and translation along that axis. The new degree of freedom here now is doing this sort of lateral translation by actuating one of the channels on the left and right of a given finger sequentially. And if I do these in out of phase, then I can create rotations. Okay, this gives us the ability to do automatic, right off the bat, gives us the ability to do some very simple in-hand motion primitives, like translating things while in a stable grasp, or rotating things in a grasp. And again, this is the rotation part is sort of making and breaking contacts, which is, again, stepping us towards what we're originally seeing in that motivational video I showed you from Julia Child, cooking things. And not surprisingly, we use a lot of food in our demonstrations for these devices. So this gives us, so these sort of parallel degrees of freedom give us a lot of additional capabilities right off the bat. So we can do things that are, continuous rotations, translation primitives. We can do both sort of manipulation of small objects, of large objects. We can do this also, by the way, the ability to have this additional degree of freedom also gives us the ability to compensate for gravity. So this is maybe something that you don't care too much about if I've got a rigid non-back drivable manipulator where I've got sufficient actuation force and perception to understand gravity and sort of I basically don't have to worry about it. In the soft hands where they're back drivable, if I don't have the ability to actuate these additional degrees of freedom and understand where gravity is, then objects have the tendency to slip from my grasp, and that's illustrated here. Okay, so parallel degrees of freedom. We've also explored serial degrees of freedom, and this is a relatively simple concept. I take my single actuator and now I add a joint and ask questions about, like, well, what is the ratio of these joint lengths, and how should I actuate them both together or separately to enhance some manipulation capabilities. And so in order to study this is starting to get into the realm of being intractable for a sort of full study experimentally. Analytically, it gets a bit difficult because how do we think about modeling not just the manipulators themselves, but the interactions that they have with their target objects, which in this case is simple, but could be rather complicated. So instead, what we did was we looked at this object set called the YCD object set, which is attempts to have objects, known sort of cataloged objects of varieties of shapes and sizes to be used as a standard for manipulation studies. And so we use that object set in a simulation tool that we developed called Somo, which is a soft motion simulator. It's basically a Python wrapper around a PyBullet engine where we create something akin to a URDF description of a soft hand or soft manipulator or any soft generic robot, and then can simulate its interactions with objects in ways that are far quicker than we can do experimentally and as well, or analytically being somewhat intractable. So we're able to do some studies over a variety of, and this is relatively simple. We've done more complicated things using this simulation environment, and basically just choose configurations which give us the best performance for whatever metric we want, grasp success, subject to different position errors, for example. But it could be things that are more dexterity related as well. This is just giving a highlight of how this soft manipulation, soft motion simulation tool can really speed up our, going from real world experiments to simulated experiments with really very little loss of fidelity. We haven't found that any of the things that we're doing within this simulation framework, everything that we're doing within the simulation framework does carry over to our hardware. So another Another thing that we've been thinking about in terms of what are these serial, what is this overall compliance value, and in particular, what are these serial compliances value within a digit, within an actuator. And one of the things that it allows you to really think about doing is grasping thin, flexible objects, which, and this is just going to illustrate if I've got a rigid gripper, okay, with rigid fingers, trying to grasp a small object, for example, or a thin, flexible material. Then we can start to think about, well, let's start to add in some compliances along defined degrees of freedom. So now vertical compliance, for example. Well, that's good. So that'll give me this vertical compliance will give me some robustness to vertical offsets, for example. That's just illustrated by this compliance ellipse. Maybe if I have lateral compliance within a gripper, that gives me the same sort of benefit, but now it just reorients where that compliance ellipse is happening. Or rotational at the base of the fingers, for example. So these are just sort of different instances of discrete compliances that I could start to think about for going from a rigid gripper to something more soft. Now, if I've got an entirely soft gripper, then I've got a compliance ellipse that starts to look more like a sphere. And now I can start to think about being robust to offsets in all directions. What does this mean? So for gripping thin objects with any gripper tends to be very dependent upon how well you can be positioning your gripper relative to that object. So that's going to rely on the quality of a perception system that you have, as well as the precision of how you can place your gripper relative to the object. So that precision is usually not that big of a deal for positioning, but for perception, especially when it comes to something like this thin object, becomes really problematic for rigid grippers. So what we're able to show here is that by having, and that's what this video is showing, let me play it again. What this video is showing is that if we have compliance within these grippers, then what's happening here is each one of these videos is a sequence where I'm sort of lowering the gripper into the surface. So I'm having more and more of an error into the surface, but showing that the fingers just passively comply to the surface as it makes contact, allowing me to still pick up this thin sheet of material. So we showed in the study that you can get an offset of a significant fraction of the length of a digit into the surface and still be able to successfully grab this object. Whereas I don't have a video of this because it's boring, but a rigid manipulator, a rigid off-the-shelf claw gripper fails at with less than 1 millimeter of offset error, and that's unsurprising. And that's shown here. So this rigid manipulator can grab it just fine if you're positioned perfectly, but even if you're up to 30 or so millimeters off, then you're not going to be able to grab this object. So what does this allow us to do? This allows us to do pinch grasps on thin sheets of material and do manipulations of fabrics. This allows us to do simple demonstrations of things like folding. This actually has some utility for a project. I probably won't have time to talk about it. We're involved in a NASA project where we're thinking about robust habitats for extraterrestrial exploration and using soft hands to apply things like tape to tape over and repair punctures for micrometeorites or whatever. Anyways, we can do folding. We can do, these are all things that are very simple for these soft grippers, but again, difficult without good perception for a rigid hand. Here's my tape example. Okay, so now we're able to have both serial and parallel degrees of freedom within our grippers, adding to the number of degrees of freedom, actuated degrees of freedom that we have in these soft hands. What else? So the finger design is only one aspect of this. There's a couple other things I wanted to mention. One is the palm. So the palm is the surface that maybe we don't think about very often, but can be useful as in the most basic sense, could be useful as a surface for applying constraints to an object for things like in-hand manipulation. And if it's an actuated surface, then it can then accommodate for objects of various sizes. And so we developed, this is the first prototype of an active palm that helps us think about reorienting an object by sort of moving it up in a grasp to more effectively interact with the digits of the hand. And again, we did this study in our simulation environment to study different very basic geometric parameters of a palm, and showed that, depending upon the object size, certain palm dimensions give you beneficial, and some, as you can see on the left, interfere with the motion of an object, in particular, for example, this sort of high aspect ratio object. And so overall, able to, if you can actuate a palm to change its size and shape, this is just a very simple 1 degree of freedom version. I'll show you a more complicated version in a minute. Then you can more successfully engage with objects. And that's probably not a surprising thing. But the point is, using a palm now, not just sort of thinking about it as a static surface that's just sort of holding everything together, but actually as an active surface which we can use in manipulation strategies. Another thing that this is very useful for is, again, for gravity compensation. So if I have an object like this where I'm doing in-hand manipulation primitives, if I rest this against a surface such as my palm, then I can compensate for gravity and do these sort of motion primitives. If I don't, I quickly, I'm under a constraint and I quickly lose the grasp, as you can see on the right here. And so, okay, so that's great. But we can do more. So that was just very simple, 1 degree of freedom actuation to adjust surface height. But this could be something beyond. This could be something more useful, for example, in modulating the surface properties. And so what we did was develop another generation of a palm where we can think about, can we actuate the surface properties, in this case friction, to create a new sort of surface over which to manipulate, not just for a sliding surface, but actually if I can control the friction such that I can then either slide or be fixed such that any forces applied by my digits then cause a moment on the object to reorient the object. So that's the basis here. And we've done this in a couple of different ways. I'm only really going to talk about this surface here, but we've also done things with controlling preloads on objects as well. I won't talk about that. But in terms of the ability to modulate friction is sort of being illustrated on the left here. So if you see this, the sort of white surface is a low friction surface. Underneath this is a high friction surface, an elastomeric surface, that if I pressurize the palm, that sort of pokes through. And now I get whatever objects on this is in contact with this, I get exposed to this high friction surface. So I can then sort of turn this on and off. And this on the right, again, I won't talk about this, but this is just showing some preload where I can sort of push into an object and almost sort of jam around an object that is in my grasp. So the low friction, high friction transition allows us to do an additional sets of axes of rotation that was not available to us before, just by using the palm as a simple sliding surface. So we can control tipping versus sliding. So I can, if in a low friction state, I can do these sort of, in plane sort of translation and rotations. Whereas if I then engage the surface and sort of turn the friction on high, then I can use this now to pivot, for example, about axes that are parallel to the palm surface. And this just gives us another group of motion primitives for in-hand manipulation that we didn't have before. So, for example, reorienting in addition to some of these sliding degrees of freedom. Penultimate consideration here is another fairly obvious one, is how should I think about how, I've been talking about the palm to talk about the fingers. I didn't tell you how they're arranged. So one thing that would be nice to think about is like, okay, well, how do I arrange these fingers? Do I have them in this sort of, I'm just showing two extremes here, but do I have them as sort of symmetric 4-finger cross versus this more anthropomorphic thing where I've got a bunch of fingers and then a thumb? Which considerations, which objects would I want to grasp that would be more or less conducive to one of these two poses, and are there things in between? So just to illustrate this, you think about this again, 4-finger cross on the left and the anthropomorphic thing on the right, and you can think about two different sort of classes of objects, things which are more sort of elongated with a sort of high aspect ratio, and that's maybe by this sort of long bun object there, or things that are kind of more spherical, like that cupcake. And so immediately here, your intuition can kick in and say, all right, well, the more sort of symmetric cross-like digit arrangement is going to be better for more sort of spherical low aspect ratio things, whereas the sort of anthropomorphic, where you've got a thumb on one side and fingers on another, are going to be more conducive to the higher aspect ratio things. And so that holds true. So we're able to show, I guess that's it on that. We're able to show that just by just doing some explorations, and it wasn't just sort of binary, these two extremes, four-finger cross or the more anthropomorphic. We did some intermediate arrangements as well between those two, and we're able to show that indeed that intuition holds, that there's a correlation between those digit configurations and the aspect ratios, the objects that you can grasp. And we actually have an actuated version of that now that goes between those two. Lastly is taking that friction tuning concept that I showed you for the palm, and now having that applied along the surface of the digits. And so this is just, again, another control variable that we can tune. Same principle applies. I have a low friction surface that I have a high friction surface underneath. If I pressurize that high friction, that internal high friction surface, it pokes out and now starts to engage with whatever object I'm in contact with. And this is about an order of magnitude in terms of the friction change. So what we can do with that is there's no, for this three-finger gripper here, there's no change in this demonstration. There's no change in the actuation pressure of the fingers. It's just the friction being turned on and off that then allows us to manipulate this object. So a very simple concept, but another effective sort of pathway for control. And this is something that we published 3 years ago. So I mentioned this tool. I'll give a couple of plugs here just to wrap this up. A couple of plugs, one being this simulation tool that one of my students, Moritz Grau, had put together. This actually started, unsurprisingly, we were doing all this fun experimental work in the lab and sort of studying some of these topics that I was been showing you for the last 30 minutes. And then COVID struck, and we're like, well, what are we going to do? So we realized the utility, kind of by necessity, of some of these simulation tools to advance our work. It's turned out to be far more productive than just a sort of COVID relief tool. And so this is something that has been extremely useful for us. And now Moritz is applying reinforcement learning techniques to try to learn soft manipulation path planning strategies for really complex manipulators. These are relatively simple examples, but he's done far more complex examples and object interactions and snake-like locomotion and interacting with all sorts of different object sizes and shapes. And anyways, that's just a plug. This is something that we have open sourced and is available to the community and is very easy to use. The second, here's an example of maybe slightly more complicated things. The second thing that I wanted to plug is how we're actually making a lot of these soft manipulators, soft devices in our lab, and that's using these techniques that are born from industry. So the techniques that we're using are primarily based in injection molding. These soft elastomers that we're using, that's not new. So injection molding, anything that you have which is elastomeric in your house has been made in an injection molding process that's obviously on an industrial scale and can do things millions of times faster than we can do in lab. But we had some nice innovations, work by Michael Bell, a recent graduate from our group, where he basically just took a large industrial scale elastomeric injection molding process and then scaled it to a lab-based process where you can create 3D printed molds, all sorts of guidelines, design guidelines for how to create those molds, how to fix those molds, even down to the part numbers that you can use to go buy all of the injection systems and which elastomers to use, and he outlines that in this paper here. So if you're interested in using this, it's something where you can, for a couple $1,000, you can do everything you can make everything that I've been showing you. Okay, I'll save 10 minutes or so for at the end for questions and discussion, but for 3 minutes, I will just tell you about a few other things that we've been working on. These are going to be pretty random. So just to give you a flavor for some of the other things we're working on in our lab, this is a project called OctoBot. This is something where we asked the question a number of years ago, can we make something which is now fully soft? Because everything that I didn't show you in those previous videos was things like, well, where's the pump and the compressor and the valves and the controllers and et cetera. This is a first attempt at a solution to get rid of all of those more rigid electromechanical components and put them all on board a soft-bodied robot. And I won't get into the details of how this works, but I showed you before that that technique with Jennifer Lewis, where embedded 3D printing was creating vasculature within soft elastomeric systems. So that's what's happening here. These sort of channels, these dark lines you can see, are fluidic networks that were printed directly within an elastomeric, in this case, a mold of an octopus. And then where you can create sort of actuation sites that form bending. This vasculature then goes to catalyst sites, which are these platinum impregnated catalyst sites within the elastomers, where the breakdown of a monopropellant is decomposed into hot gases, which then power these actuators. This is all controlled through a microfluidic oscillator circuit. So we've got power stored in a stored fuel, control within a microfluidic network, very simple control, it's just oscillating. Again, power, which is sort of having this catalytic decomposition of the monopropellant fuel into hot gases that then form actuation, and you get this sort of robot that does this. So not a very impressive robot, but the first example of something that embodies all of these, many, not all, of these functions that we take for granted in sort of electromechanical systems now in soft-bodied robots. This is a related example of using expanding microfluidics and soft lithography techniques to create fluidic elastomeric structures that are sort of based upon these laminates. So it's like a 14-layer soft laminates, where I can then have vias that go between the layers and form complex motions in these in this entirely soft device. One of the other cool things is that, you know, these little like knee joint things here. I can create asymmetric bending, and I can create, you know, a leg that kind of bends down or up or whatever. But if I pump in, this is all using water. But if I pump in a fluid, which is an uncured epoxy, for example, or another uncured elastomer, and if it's UV-based curing system or thermal curing system, I can sort of bend exposed to UV or thermally cured or whatever, and now it's in a fixed shape. So I get this sort of three-dimensional assembly techniques by virtue of these microfluidic networks as well. We do things in small-scale robots, and Mark was alluding to that at first. This is a little legged platform that we've been working on for a number of years now, which is fully autonomous, and we use this for a number of things in terms of exploring some of the underlying physics of locomotion, terramechanics of locomotion, bioinspiration for locomotion at small scales, actuation, microfabrication, questions about control powers, etc. Also turns out to be rather interesting from a practical use point, because as I get smaller, gravity tends not to matter, right? Volumetric forces don't matter as much as surface forces at small scales, and so we can take advantage of that and get these things to climb on vertical and inverted surfaces. For example, we're using this for engine inspection for as a pilot study for with Rolls-Royce. So there's if you can get these things that are small enough to get into places, and now if we can show that we can climb on surfaces, well, that gets interesting from things like inspection. Another project that I was alluding to before was this Resilient Extraterrestrial Habitat Institute. This is a NASA project where we're looking at robots, soft robots in particular, to assist with the construction and maintenance of extraterrestrial habitats prior to human arrival, and then sort of operate in a sort of co-robotic fashion once humans do arrive. That's an exciting one. I won't get into that too much. And then lastly, we're part of this new project is called Project SETI, the Cetacean Translation Initiative, which is focused on decoding the communications of sperm whales and eventually talking back. The way that we are going about this, and our portion of this is on the robotics side, which is the data collection side. So how can we, I'll play this video here. We're developing these sort of technologies, tags, which will go on the surface of whales, record a whole bunch of audio. And again, these are delicate, these are suction-based devices. So thinking about adhesion, soft devices for adhesion. We're developing drones that can go sort of, that was a manually deployed one, but drones to go deploy and collect these things underwater swimming things to go collect audio and video and other metadata. The idea is to collect as much data as possible, feed it to our machine learning friends, and have them decode structure and eventually go into language. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you for joining us this morning. Again, I wish I was there in person with you, but hopefully see you all at ICRA, and happy to continue the discussions there, but happy to answer some questions and have a discussion now.
Great, thank you, Rob. That was super interesting. So for those of you online who have questions, you can, maybe the easiest thing is to do the Q&A, and I'll moderate, but we've got one question already. From Jennifer. She's asking, I'm curious how this research fits with advances in prosthetic hands in the medical domain. It seems that they would share many of the challenges you've been addressing. Can they also share solutions? Do people work together across these fields?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I do see a lot of synergies between prosthetics and some of the soft manipulators that we're working on. I feel like it's early enough stage that some of the stuff that I'm showing now is just sort of exploration to see what types of hands and materials and digit designs and digit arrangements and all of that are going to be useful generally. Then maybe one of the things I was hoping to get across, we also think about some of the practicality of these things, not just like, oh, can we make a nice hand, but what does it take to drive that hand? What are the what are the sort of power, the fluidic power requirements? We also work on a number of different actuation strategies, not just fluidic actuation. We have a lot of work in dielectric elastomeric actuators, for example. So what would be the most relevant actuation strategy for us? Fluidics is very convenient because we can just have use house air and compressors and whatever especially for fixed static manipulators that aren't moving around. For something like a prosthetic, that might be less practical. So I think some of these things that we work out in terms of design then would need to be translated for sort of practical, uses for something that needs to be mobile. We need to think about then if it's fluidic, then compact pumps and valve networks. That's actually another thread of our research that's happening in parallel that I didn't really talk about. Is alluded to a little bit with the OctoBot, but fluidic soft controllers to make some of those other components for example, things like prosthetics more practical. But I think it's kind of baby steps. So again, us sort of, and many others, figuring out how to design soft hands, thinking about some of these practical things. I think there's intermediate steps, like there's a number of our colleagues that are making orthotics, which would just be assistive devices and not sort of replacement of function, but actually sort of assisting with restoring function. I think that's an intermediate step because they could then maybe alleviate some of the power requirements by still relying on some of the underlying musculature. So yeah, but I do see eventually then getting towards some sort of minimal, maybe not some many fingered thing that I was showing here, but some more minimal design with considerations for sensing and for power and for control, also in sort of a compact structure. I do see some synergy with prosthetics. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer.
That was super interesting. Kind of along the lines of medical devices, there's another question on what design challenges do you see for soft robots for minimally invasive surgeries or other healthcare applications?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the soft robotics is, in my opinion, a huge promise for all surgery, not just minimally invasive, but all surgery. Anything where, if you just look at some of the state of the art, for example, for tissue and organ retractors are big metal hooks, right? And you go and just sort of pry things apart, and you're extremely impedance mismatched there, right? And so that can cause damage, and this is known. So that's one area, just sort of gross organ manipulation. Being matched to the impedance of the organ will give you a lot less chance of actually harming anything within the body, but that's not really your question. So for minimally invasive, so getting down into the sort of sizes that would be required for example, natural orifice surgery or endoscopic or laparoscopic. So one of the things I think that is a challenge is scaling down. So a lot of the things, if I want sort of human level, a lot of what I'm talking about is human level dexterity, right? So that's missing in any minimally invasive surgery already, right? Because we go away from being open, and then your suite of tools that you're using for these surgeries are highly constrained by both the delivery tool as well as the surgical site, the size of the surgical site. So if we can use a lot of the same techniques for soft manipulation that we have at larger scales, shrink them down. So that's the first challenge I see is can we take some of the sort of macro scale stuff that we've been doing for soft manipulation, shrink it down, give a similar level of dexterity. Then we already know through some discussions with a variety of surgeons, in particular endoscopists, we know a bunch of things that we want to do. We want to sort of hold place against the wall. We want to grab a tissue so the tool can cut it. We want to aspirate something. We want to poke it, palpate something and see what its material properties are. Whatever. There's a suite of things that we have good evidence that would be useful. So shrinking down, I think, is the main thing. And that was one of the motivations, actually the primary motivation for that little spider-looking thing that we were making out of these microfluidic networks. That's exactly that motivation.
Wow, really cool. So another question, seems like your soft robotics focus a lot on dexterous in the way of kinematics. What is your approach to dexterous and dynamical tasks, such as juggling?
Good question. I don't think you're right. We do think of things mostly in quasi-static motions, and we're not really exploiting dynamics here in any real way. I think that for a lot of the fluidic devices that we're showing, the actuation speeds are going to be limited by the fluidic networks, and so I'm not sure dynamic things is really a good target for them. But as I was mentioning before, we have a number of projects that are, well, one main thread of developing dielectrical elastomer actuators, which there's a whole bunch of interesting questions there. But the benefits there are that you have bandwidths which are far exceed what you can achieve with these fluidically actuated soft actuators. And so, several hundred hertz, for example, actuators that we've been creating. So I think that with other soft actuation technologies, like dielectrical elastomers, not exclusively, liquid crystal elastomers, another promising candidate. I think it comes down to actuation and the types of actuation, bandwidth of actuation you can achieve. I think it's one of the hardest things to do in all of engineering is create something muscle-like. But if I can create something muscle-like with similar bandwidths and energy densities, then I can do your juggling example. I don't think we're quite there yet.
Let me just insert one quick follow-up from me. The simulator you have, the Somo Simulator, it looked like it was modeling friction. And I assume it doesn't do dynamics, or does it?
It is. It's full dynamic, full friction. It's just it's a pi bullet backend. So it's really a light wrapper around pi bullet.
So everything that's there, we could use. Okay, cool. Last question from Rujna. Energizing the soft robot is a problem. Can you outline beyond microfluidics, what do you see in the future?
Sure. A couple of thoughts. I think this is a big problem. So I would say that for the fluidic soft robots, I think that this is a challenge. So I think that the primary challenges there are, well, can I have something? Can I bring a lot of the power and control functions on board the soft robot so that they're not just sort of living in a big metal box on the side? If I have an application where I can deal with a big box on the side, then energizing a fluidic soft robot is not a problem, but that obviously limits what I can do, in particular for things that might want to be mobile. So there are, within the confines of fluidic, still staying within fluidic soft robots, there's alternative things you might be able to do. For example, I just saw a really interesting talk by Rob Shepard, who was talking about basically flow batteries, where the energy source is also an actuation source. So I thought that was pretty clever. Maybe there's some clever things you can do there. We've done in the past some chemical fuels. So if you those tend to be highly nonlinear, of course. And so, if you have a way to sort of really carefully control a chemical, decomposition or combustion process, whatever,
Right, Rob Wood, thank you very much. Fantastic talk.